The Galactic Council had a saying, "When the universe bleeds, only humans smile." They thought it was an insult. They were wrong. For 3,000 years, humanity had been the galaxy's unwanted stepchild, too violent for diplomacy, too unpredictable for alliance, too dangerous to ignore. While other species built vast empires through negotiation and trade, humans carved out their tiny corner of space with nothing but determination and an alarming tendency to survive the impossible. Now, as the Void Swarm consumed entire star systems and reduced ancient civilizations to cosmic dust, the same alien races who had shunned humanity for millennia were about to discover why humans didn't just survive the impossible, they thrived in it. The universe was about to learn that when all hope is lost, when civilizations crumble and gods weep, humanity doesn't pray for salvation. They become it. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been going on for 6 hours, and Ambassador Zethkar could taste the fear in the recycled air. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their respective atmospheric bubbles, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of terror that the universal translators struggled to process. Zethkar's 4 eyes focused on the holographic display floating in the center of the Grand Chamber. Red dots marked the systems that had gone dark in the past month. 17 civilizations, some older than Earth's sun, reduced to silence. The Void Swarm had consumed them all. The Kepler defense grid fell 6 hours ago, announced Council of X-High, her crystalline form dimming with each word. The entire Kepler system gone. 30 billion souls. A collective shudder ran through the assembly. The Kepler defense grid had been considered impregnable, protected by energy shields that could repel a supernova. The fact that the swarm had breached it so easily sent waves of panic through the council chambers. "What do our military advisors recommend?" asked High Chancellor Mordun, his tentacles writhing with anxiety. General Thaxon of the Hegemony Navy stepped forward, his exoskeleton clicking against the floor. "Honorable representatives, I must be frank. Our combined fleets have engaged the swarm 17 times. We have not won a single battle. Every encounter results in total destruction of our forces, while the swarm appears to grow stronger." The chamber erupted in terrified voices, each species contributing to the growing din of despair. Some delegates were already transmitting evacuation orders to their homeworlds. Others sat in stunned silence, watching their millennia-old civilizations face extinction. Zethkar had served on the council for 2 centuries, and he had never seen anything like this. The Void Swarm defied every principle of galactic warfare. They didn't communicate, didn't negotiate, didn't even seem to have a recognizable technology. They simply appeared in a system, consumed everything organic, and moved on, leaving behind empty shells of dead worlds. "Perhaps," suggested Councillor Lethera of the Trade Federation, "it's time we considered unconventional solutions." The chamber fell silent. Everyone knew what she meant. "You cannot be serious." General Thaxon's voice carried disbelief. "The humans? They're barely more civilized than the swarm itself." Zethkar had to admit that the general wasn't entirely wrong. Humanity had been admitted to the Galactic Council only 300 years ago, and their membership remained controversial. While other species had evolved beyond warfare through millions of years of social development, humans still carried their violent heritage like a badge of honor. Their military tactics were considered barbaric by galactic standards. Where civilized species engaged in orbital bombardment and clean energy warfare, humans still used kinetic weapons, chemical explosives, and close combat. They had actually volunteered to fight in every major conflict of the past 3 centuries, not for resources or territory, but simply because, as one human general had put it, it seemed like fun. Most disturbing of all, they were the only known species that actively sought out dangerous situations. While other races developed technology to avoid conflict, humans developed technology to win it. Their entertainment consisted of simulated violence. Their sports involved physical contact, and their exploration missions regularly ventured into regions that other species marked as forbidden. The human military doctrines are crude, admitted Counselor Lathura, but they have one advantage our refined tactics lack: unpredictability. The swarm appears to adapt to our standard military approaches. Perhaps something completely irrational might catch them off guard. High Chancellor Mordunn's massive form shifted uncomfortably. Are we truly so desperate that we would unleash the humans? They might cause more damage than the swarm itself. Zethkar accessed his files on humanity's military record. The numbers were disturbing. In 300 years of council membership, humans had been involved in 92 separate conflicts. They had lost exactly 3 of them, and only because they had been ordered to withdraw by the council. In the other 89 conflicts, they had achieved victory through methods that military historians still struggled to classify. The Battle of Zirion Prime remained a textbook example of human irrationality. Faced with a fortified enemy position that would have taken 6 months to reduce through conventional siege warfare, the human commander had instead loaded a ship with explosives and crashed it directly into the enemy fortress. The resulting explosion had ended the battle in 47 minutes. Or the infamous rescue at Telos Station, where human marines had used emergency airlocks to literally throw themselves through space to board an enemy vessel, then fought their way through the ship using nothing but personal weapons and what they called aggressive enthusiasm. The more civilized species found such tactics incomprehensible. Elegant strategy, technological superiority, and overwhelming firepower were the hallmarks of proper warfare. The human approach of charge directly at the problem until it stops being a problem violated every principle of military science. Yet it worked. I've reviewed the human combat records. General Thak Sun continued, his mandibles clicking with distress. Their casualty rates are astronomical. They regularly suffer losses that would break the morale of any civilized force, yet somehow they continue fighting. It's as if they don't understand that war is supposed to be won efficiently, not survived desperately. Zethkar pulled up footage from the siege of Terminus 7, where human forces had held off a vastly superior enemy for 8 months. The final transmission from the human commander had been particularly unsettling. We're down to our last ammunition, our supplies are gone, and we're having the time of our lives. Send more enemies. The siege had ended when human reinforcements had arrived, not to rescue the surviving defenders, but to join what they called the party. There is something else to consider, interrupted Dr. Yilnara, the council's chief xenobiologist. Human psychology differs significantly from our own. While we experience fear as a deterrent to dangerous action, humans appear to experience something they call adrenaline rush that actually makes them more effective in dangerous situations. She activated a holographic display showing human brain scans during combat. Notice how their neurological activity increases during life-threatening scenarios. Rather than triggering retreat responses, extreme danger appears to enhance their cognitive and physical capabilities. General Thak Sun examined the data with obvious discomfort. You're telling me that humans become more dangerous when they're in mortal peril? Precisely. It's as if their species evolved specifically for scenarios where survival is unlikely. They don't just adapt to impossible odds. They appear to be optimized for them. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The Galactic Council had spent 3 million years evolving beyond the need for such brutal adaptations. They had built their civilizations on logic, cooperation, and the careful avoidance of unnecessary risk. Humans, it seemed, had evolved in the opposite direction. There's one more factor, added Counselor Lathura quietly. Our intelligence reports suggest that humans don't view the swarm as an existential threat. They view it as what they call a target-rich environment. High Chancellor Mordunn's tentacles coiled in distress. They want to fight the swarm? According to intercepted communications from the human military command, they're actually excited about the prospect. One of their generals described it as, finally, an enemy that won't surrender before things get interesting. The council chamber erupted in alarmed chittering, clicking, and harmonizing as each species expressed their horror in their own way. The idea that any rational being would welcome a confrontation with a void swarm was beyond their comprehension. Zethkar studied the tactical displays once more. Every conventional approach had failed. The combined might of 47 civilizations had proven inadequate against the swarm's relentless advance. At the current rate of expansion, the entire galaxy would be consumed within 2 years. The choice was becoming clear: extinction through inaction, or the unknown consequences of unleashing humanity's unique brand of organized chaos. "I call for a vote," Zethkar announced, his voice cutting through the panicked discussions. "All in favor of formally requesting human military assistance in combating the Void Swarm." The silence that followed was deafening. For long minutes, no delegate moved. The weight of the decision pressed down on them like the gravity of a collapsing star. Finally, High Chancellor Mordun raised one massive tentacle. "The universe forgive us," he rumbled, "but I vote yes." One by one, other tentacles, appendages, and energy fields rose in agreement. When the count was complete, 39 species had voted to unleash humanity upon the galaxy's greatest threat. As the session ended and delegates began filing out to transmit the fateful decision to their home worlds, Zethkar remained behind, staring at the tactical displays. The red dots marking dead systems seemed to pulse like wounds in the galaxy's flesh. He wondered if they had just made the greatest decision in galactic history, or the greatest mistake. Time would tell if humanity's ruthless soldiers were the salvation the galaxy needed, or simply another kind of destruction waiting to be unleashed. In the distance, he could already hear the first reports of human battle fleets moving into position, their crews eager for what they called the fight of their lives. The universe was about to discover what happened when an irresistible force met an immovable object, and both of them were absolutely insane. Admiral Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the UES Indomitable, watching the impossible sight unfolding on the main display. The Void Swarm filled the space around Proxima Station like a living shadow, their biomechanical forms defying every principle of known physics. Ships the size of cities pulsed with organic energy, while smaller creatures that looked like mechanized nightmares swarmed between them in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Beautiful, isn't it?" commented Captain Rodriguez from the tactical station. "I've never seen anything so magnificently terrifying in my entire career." Shin smiled grimly. She had been fighting for 30 years, from the Centauri Rebellion to the Titan Wars, and she had never encountered an enemy quite like this. The swarm didn't follow conventional tactics or predictable patterns. They simply consumed everything in their path with single-minded determination, which made them perfect. "Admiral," reported Lieutenant Kim from Communications, "we're receiving surrender broadcasts from the Proxima Defense Force. They're requesting immediate evacuation assistance. Tell them to maintain position and continue fighting," Chun replied without hesitation. "We'll be there shortly." "Ma'am, with respect, the Proxima Defense Force has been reduced to 12 ships from an original fleet of 200. They're requesting evacuation because they're about to be wiped out." Chun turned to face the young officer, her expression calm, but her eyes blazing with the intensity that had made her legendary among human military circles. "Lieutenant, let me explain something about human military doctrine that they clearly haven't taught you yet. We don't evacuate. We escalate." The bridge crew exchanged glances that mixed anticipation with barely controlled excitement. They had all volunteered for this mission specifically because it offered what human military personnel valued above all else: a fight that nobody else wanted. "Sir," called out Commander Parks from the sensor station, "the Galactic Council fleets are pulling back to minimum safe distance. They're transmitting warnings about the swarm's adaptive capabilities." "Of course they are," Chin muttered. "They've been fighting this thing for months using the same tired strategies: orbital bombardment, energy weapons, and careful tactical positioning. No wonder the swarm figured out how to counter them." She activated the ship's internal communications. "Attention all hands, this is the Admiral speaking. In approximately 27 minutes, we will be engaging an enemy that has destroyed 17 civilizations and consumed 30 billion lives. They adapt to conventional tactics, they don't negotiate, and they've never been defeated. Throughout the ship, crew members paused in their preparations to listen. In the Marine quarters, soldiers checked their weapons with the methodical precision of professionals. In engineering, technicians made final adjustments to systems that had been modified specifically for this engagement. In the medical bays, doctors prepared for casualties while humming old battle songs. I want you all to know, Chun continued, that High Command has given us complete tactical freedom for this engagement. No restrictions on weapons usage, no limitations on strategic approach, and no requirements to preserve enemy assets for study. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, we have been given permission to be ourselves. The cheer that echoed through the ship's corridors was audible even on the bridge. Chun cut the connection and turned back to the tactical display. The human fleet consisted of only 50 ships, a tiny force compared to the massive armadas that the Galactic Council had deployed. But each human vessel had been designed according to a fundamentally different philosophy than the sleek, efficient ships of the other species. Where alien vessels prioritized shields and long-range weapons, human ships were built like flying fortresses, bristling with armor and close-range firepower. Where other races focused on elegant maneuvering and tactical positioning, humans designed ships that could ram through enemy formations and keep fighting with half their systems destroyed. Most importantly, human ships were crewed by individuals who considered mortal danger to be a recreational activity. "Admiral," reported Commander Parks, "we're detecting massive energy signatures from the swarm. They appear to be preparing some kind of coordinated assault on the remaining Proxima defenders." Chin studied the sensor data, watching as hundreds of swarm vessels began moving into attack formation. Their movement patterns were hypnotic, flowing like a dark tide that promised to wash away everything in its path. "Interesting," she mused. "They're concentrating their forces for a decisive strike. Very efficient, very predictable." Mom. Lieutenant Kim looked confused. "How is that predictable? Our tactical computers can't even model their movement patterns." "That's because you're thinking like a civilized person," Chen explained patiently. "The swarm isn't using complex tactics. They're using the simplest tactic in existence, overwhelming force applied directly to the target. It's brutally effective against enemies who expect sophisticated strategy." She activated the fleet communications array. "All ships, this is Admiral Chun. The enemy is demonstrating textbook swarming behavior. They're going to hit the Proxima defenders with everything they've got, expecting to overwhelm them through sheer numbers." Throughout the human fleet, captains leaned forward in their command chairs with expressions of predatory interest. "This gives us an excellent opportunity to demonstrate the difference between swarming and proper aggressive assault. All ships will execute attack pattern Omega on my mark. Remember, we're not here to outmaneuver them or outthink them. We're here to hit them harder than they've ever been hit before." Chen watched as the human ships began moving into position. Attack pattern Omega was considered suicidal by galactic military standards. It involved charging directly into the heart of an enemy formation with no regard for tactical positioning or strategic withdrawal routes. The goal was not to win through superior strategy, but to create so much chaos and destruction that the enemy would be unable to maintain coherent resistance. It was, in other words, perfectly suited for fighting an enemy that relied on overwhelming numbers. "Admiral," called Captain Rodriguez, "the Galactic Council observers are requesting clarification on our tactical approach. They want to know if we're planning to coordinate with their remaining forces." "Tell them to stay back and take notes," Chen replied. "They're about to witness 300 years of human military innovation in action." The swarm had begun their assault on Proxima Station. Thousands of biomechanical creatures swept forward in a tide of destruction that had consumed worlds. Energy blasts that could crack planetary crusts lanced out from the larger vessels, while smaller attackers swarmed over the defending ships like metallic piranhas. The 12 remaining Proxima defenders were fighting valiantly, but their elegant energy weapons and defensive maneuvering were proving inadequate against the swarm's relentless advance. One by one, their ships were being overwhelmed and consumed. All ships, Chen announced calmly. Execute attack pattern Omega. Remember, the goal is not to survive this engagement. The goal is to make the enemy regret starting it. The human fleet accelerated toward the battle zone with a velocity that made the Galactic Council observers gasp in alarm. Rather than approaching cautiously or attempting to flank the enemy formation, the humans simply pointed their ships at the center of the swarm and engaged their engines at maximum power. What happened next will be studied by military historians for generations. The first wave of human ships hit the swarm formation like a hammer striking glass. But instead of shattering against superior numbers, the human vessels unleashed weapons that no civilized species had used in millennia. Kinetic projectiles traveling at significant fractions of light speed punched through biomechanical armor that had shrugged off energy weapons. Chemical explosives detonated in chain reactions that sent swarm creatures spinning helplessly through space. Most shocking of all, when swarm vessels attempted to board the human ships, they encountered something they had never faced before. Defenders who welcomed close combat. On the UES Relentless, Captain Morrison watched through internal sensors as swarm creatures cut through his ship's hull and poured into the corridors. Rather than ordering his crew to defensive positions, he grabbed a rifle and joined the Marines who were rushing toward the breach points. Finally, he muttered to his first officer as they ran through the corridors, "A boarding action where we get to be the boarders too." The swarm creatures had evolved to overwhelm defenders who retreated in the face of their horrific appearance. They had not evolved to face enemies who responded to invasion by organizing impromptu hunting parties. Throughout the human fleet, similar scenes were playing out. Ships that would have been considered lost by any other species were turning into battlegrounds where human crews fought with the desperate joy of people who had finally found an enemy worthy of their attention. The swarm, for the first time in their recorded existence, began to show signs of confusion. "Admiral," reported Commander Parks, his voice filled with awe, "the swarm formation is beginning to destabilize. They appear to be adapting their tactics in real time." Chun watched as the enemy vessels began changing their attack patterns, trying to counter the human assault. It was exactly what she had hoped for. "Excellent," she said calmly. "Now we find out if they can adapt fast enough." She activated the fleet communications again. "All ships, the enemy is attempting to modify their tactics. This is your authorization to implement Doctrine 7. Even among the human crew, Doctrine 7 was considered extreme. It was based on the principle that if conventional tactics weren't working, the solution was not to retreat or regroup, but to abandon conventional tactics entirely and pursue victory through methods so irrational that no sane enemy could predict them. On the UES Thunderchild, Captain Yang received the authorization and grinned fiercely. "You heard the Admiral," he announced to his crew. "We're going crazy." The ship immediately changed course, accelerating directly toward the largest swarm vessel in the formation. Rather than attacking it with weapons, Yang intended to ram it at maximum velocity while simultaneously detonating his ship's entire ammunition supply. Similar decisions were being made throughout the human fleet, as captains who had spent their careers dreaming of the perfect last stand finally found their opportunity. The Galactic Council observers watched in horror and fascination as the human fleet transformed from a military force into something that resembled a natural disaster with delusions of tactical coherence. And slowly, incredibly, the swarm began to fall back. For the first time in their expansion across the galaxy, they had encountered something more irrational and unpredictable than themselves. The battle was just beginning. Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez had been having the best day of her military career when the swarm creature burst through the ventilation shaft above her head. She had just finished rigging the ship's main corridor with enough explosive charges to level a small building. And now she had a perfect test subject. The creature was magnificent in its horror, standing nearly 3 meters tall with biomechanical arms that ended in weapons capable of cutting through ship armor. Its multiple eyes tracked movement with predatory precision, and organic energy coursed through circuits that pulsed beneath translucent skin. "Hey there, beautiful," Vasquez greeted it cheerfully, hefting her plasma rifle. "Want to dance?" The creature responded by firing a beam of concentrated energy that would have vaporized any normal human. Vasquez had rolled behind cover before the trigger was even pulled, her enhanced reflexes and 3 decades of combat experience making her movements almost prescient. What followed was a running gun battle through the corridors of the UES Indomitable that perfectly illustrated why humanity had become the galaxy's most feared military force. While other species developed tactics to avoid close combat, humans had perfected the art of turning any environment into a lethal maze. Vasquez led the creature through corridors where she had position motion sensors, around corners where explosive charges waited, and past crew quarters where her fellow Marines were positioned with heavy weapons. Every step of the chase had been planned, every angle of attack anticipated. The creature was fast, deadly, and intelligent enough to adapt to her tactics in real time. Under normal circumstances, it would have been more than a match for any individual soldier. But Vasquez wasn't fighting alone, and these weren't normal circumstances. Incoming ugly at Junction 7. She called into her comm unit while diving through a maintenance hatch. "Someone want to give it a warm welcome?" The response came in the form of concentrated plasma fire from 4 different directions, turning the corridor junction into a brief star. When the light faded, the swarm creature was still advancing, its biomechanical armor adapting to absorb the energy weapons. "Well, that's new," commented Corporal Jenkins from his position behind an improvised barricade. "They're getting tougher." "No problem," Vasquez replied, pulling a device from her belt that would have horrified any civilized military observer. "Let's see how they handle some old-fashioned chemistry." The improvised incendiary device she threw contained a mixture of compounds that burned hot enough to melt ship bulkheads. The swarm creature's armor began to glow white-hot as the chemical fire spread across its surface. Rather than retreating, the creature charged directly through the flames, its weapons adapting to fire projectiles instead of energy beams. Vasquez grinned. "Now we're talking." Throughout the ship, similar engagements were taking place as human crew members discovered that the swarm's greatest weakness was also humanity's greatest strength: the complete inability to recognize when a situation was hopeless. On the bridge, Admiral Chun watched the tactical displays with professional interest. The human fleet had lost 18 ships in the first hour of combat, casualties that would have been considered catastrophic by any other species. But rather than weakening human resolve, the losses seemed to be inspiring the remaining crews to fight with even greater intensity. "Admiral," reported Commander Parks, "the UES Relentless just rammed the swarm command vessel at full velocity. Both ships are gone, but the enemy formation is breaking apart." "And Captain Morrison?" Chin asked. His final transmission was, "Tell my wife I went out in style." Parks replied with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. Chin nodded solemnly. Morrison had been a good officer and a better friend, but he had also died exactly as he had lived, making the enemy regret their life choices. "What's our current tactical situation?" she asked. "The swarm has adapted to our weapons and tactics," reported Captain Rodriguez. "They're using our own aggressive strategies against us, trying to overwhelm our ships through close assault." Chin smiled coldly. "Excellent. They think they understand us." She activated the fleet communications. "All remaining ships, this is Admiral Chun. The enemy has successfully adapted to Phase 1 operations. You are authorized to implement Phase 2. The response from the remaining human vessels was immediate and enthusiastic. Phase 2 was based on the principle that if the enemy had adapted to your current tactics, the solution was not to retreat, but to implement tactics so insane that adaptation was impossible. On the UES Vengeance, Captain Park received the authorization and turned to his crew with an expression of pure joy. "Gentlemen, we've been saving the good stuff for a special occasion. I'd say this qualifies. Minutes later, the first human ship to successfully weaponize its own destruction appeared on the tactical displays. Rather than simply ramming enemy vessels, Captain Park had modified his ship's reactor to create a cascading overload that would detonate with the force of a small star. The resulting explosion vaporized 3 swarm vessels and damaged a dozen more, creating a gap in their formation that the remaining human ships immediately exploited. But, more importantly, it demonstrated to the swarm that humans were capable of tactical innovations that defied every principle of rational warfare. The Galactic Council observers, monitoring the battle from what they had considered a safe distance, were beginning to understand why the other species had been so reluctant to involve humanity in galactic conflicts. "Are they winning?" asked Chancellor Mordun, his tentacles writhing with anxiety as he watched the tactical displays. "Define winning," replied General Thaxsun grimly. "They're inflicting massive casualties on the swarm, but they're also destroying themselves in the process. Half their fleet is gone. But the swarm is retreating," pointed out Dr. Yilnara. "For the first time since this war began, the enemy is actually falling back." It was true. The Void Swarm, which had never shown anything but relentless advance in the face of galactic resistance, was beginning to withdraw from the battle zone. Their biomechanical forms were moving away from Proxima Station with what could only be described as cautious confusion. On the UES Indomitable, Admiral Chun watched the enemy retreat with satisfaction. "Signal all ships," she ordered. "Poursuite formation." "We're not letting them get away." "Ma'am," interrupted Lieutenant Kim, "our ships are heavily damaged. Shouldn't we consolidate our position and call for reinforcements?" Chen looked at the young officer with the patient expression of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. "Lieutenant, the enemy is running away. In human military doctrine, there's only one appropriate response to a retreating enemy, which is chase them down and make sure they keep running." The remaining human ships, many of them trailing atmosphere and burning debris, accelerated in pursuit of the swarm fleet. To any rational observer, it was a suicidal gesture. The human forces were outnumbered 10-1, operating with damaged ships and depleted supplies. But the swarm had made a critical error in their tactical calculations. They had assumed that humans would respond to battlefield damage the way other species did, by retreating to repair and regroup. Instead, the humans were doing what they always did when faced with a damaged ship and a dangerous enemy. They were using the damage as a weapon. Captain Santos of the UES Defiant had lost primary power, life support, and most of his weapon systems. Any rational commander would have ordered evacuation. Instead, he redirected all remaining power to the engines and aimed his crippled vessel at the largest swarm ship he could find. "This is Captain Santos to all human vessels," he transmitted on the open channel. "My ship is done for, but I'm taking some of these bastards with me. Anyone want to make this interesting?" The response was immediate. Captain Nakamura of the UES Stalwart announced that her ship had also taken critical damage and would be joining Santos in what they were calling the galaxy's most expensive game of chicken. Within minutes, 6 critically damaged human ships were accelerating toward the swarm fleet in what the Galactic Council observers would later describe as the most beautiful act of collective insanity in recorded military history. The swarm tried to adapt. They attempted to intercept the human vessels with defensive fire, then with ramming attacks of their own. But they made the same mistake that every enemy of humanity eventually made. They assumed that fear of death would eventually overcome the human drive to inflict maximum damage. The biomechanical creatures that had consumed civilizations found themselves facing something they had never encountered before, an enemy that considered mutual destruction to be an acceptable victory condition. When the last damaged human ship collided with a swarm command vessel, an explosion visible from 3 star systems away, the remaining enemy forces made a decision that shocked every observer. They jumped to hyperspace. The Void Swarm, unstoppable devourer of worlds, conqueror of 17 civilizations, had retreated from battle against a force one-tenth their size. In the aftermath, as rescue ships moved in to collect survivors from the human fleet, Admiral Chen stood on her damaged bridge and surveyed the tactical displays. 23 of 50 ships lost, with heavy casualties among the survivors. By any civilized standard, it had been a disaster. "Admiral," reported Commander Parks, "we're receiving a transmission from the Galactic Council. They're asking for a casualty report." Chen considered the question carefully. "How did you explain to species that had evolved beyond warfare that losing half your force in a single battle was actually an acceptable outcome?" "Tell them," she said finally, "that we achieved our primary objective. The enemy has been reminded that this galaxy belongs to someone else." She paused, watching as swarm vessels continued their retreat toward the outer rim of the galaxy. "And tell them we're just getting started. The Battle of Proxima Station was over, but the war was just beginning. And for the first time since the swarm had appeared, the galaxy had reason to hope. Even if that hope came in the form of organized, professional, extremely dangerous insanity." 3 weeks after the Battle of Proxima Station, the war had transformed into something that military theorists across the galaxy were struggling to comprehend. The Void Swarm, which had previously moved through space in unstoppable waves of destruction, had begun to exhibit behaviors that could only be described as cautious. They were learning to fear. General Marcus Kane stood in the command center of Firebase Alpha, humanity's newly constructed forward operating base in the contested Centauri sector. The facility had been built in record time using a combination of human engineering and salvaged alien technology, creating a fortress that looked like something designed by someone who had never heard of architectural aesthetics, but knew a great deal about making things explode-resistant. "Sir," reported Colonel Martinez from the intelligence station, "long-range sensors are detecting swarm movement in the Vega system. They appear to be probing our defenses." Kane studied the tactical hologram floating in the center of the command room. Red icons marked swarm vessels moving in careful, measured patterns around the edges of human-controlled space. It was a behavior they had never exhibited before encountering humanity. "They're testing us," Kane observed, "trying to understand our capabilities without committing to full engagement." "It's working too," added Major Chun from the tactical station. "Our patrol fleets have engaged them 17 times in the past week, and they retreat every time we inflict significant casualties." Kane nodded grimly. The swarm's new caution was both encouraging and problematic. On one hand, it meant they were no longer the unstoppable force that had terrorized the galaxy. On the other hand, it suggested they were learning to fight humans more effectively. "What's the status of Operation Prometheus?" Kane asked. Colonel Martinez's expression grew uncomfortable. "The Galactic Council is expressing concerns about the operation's scope and methodology." Kane wasn't surprised. Operation Prometheus was humanity's solution to the strategic problem posed by the swarm's vast numbers. If conventional tactics weren't sufficient to defeat an enemy that outnumbered human forces 1,000 to 1, then humans would simply have to abandon conventional tactics entirely. The operation involved the deployment of what human military planners cheerfully called aggressive terraforming technology. Rather than fighting the swarm ship by ship, humanity intended to modify entire star systems to become hostile to swarm biology while remaining habitable for organic life. Other species called it weaponizing stellar engineering. Humans called it thinking big. "Sir," interrupted Lieutenant Torres from communications, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Admiral Chun. She's requesting immediate conference with all sector commanders." The holographic display shimmered and resolved into the image of Admiral Chun, transmitting from the bridge of her flagship somewhere in deep space. She looked exactly as she had during the Battle of Proxima Station, calm, professional, and radiating the kind of confidence that made enemies reconsider their life choices. "Generals," she began without preamble, "I'm transmitting from the edge of the Andromeda Void, where we've just completed reconnaissance of the swarm's primary staging area. The display shifted to show long-range sensor data that made every human officer lean forward with interest. Hundreds of swarm vessels were arranged in complex formations around what appeared to be a massive biomechanical structure the size of a small moon. Ladies and gentlemen, Chen continued, we found their command center. Kane studied the images with the eye of someone who had spent 40 years learning to kill things efficiently. The swarm installation was clearly more than just a military base. It was a processing facility designed to convert organic matter from conquered worlds into new swarm vessels and creatures. Intelligence estimates that facility has processed material from at least 12 different civilizations, Chen reported, including the populations of worlds that were consumed before we entered this war. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Every human officer understood what they were looking at, not just a strategic target, but a monument to genocide on an unimaginable scale. What's our tactical assessment? Kane asked quietly. The installation is defended by approximately 3,000 swarm vessels of various classes, Chen replied. Our current available forces consist of 147 ships, including vessels from the surviving Galactic Council fleets that have volunteered to support our operations. The mathematics were stark. Even with their proven ability to inflict disproportionate casualties, human forces would be outnumbered 20-1 in any assault on the swarm stronghold. Sir, interrupted Major Chun, the Galactic Council representatives are requesting permission to address this planning session. Kane sighed. The Council delegates have been making increasingly urgent requests for consultation on human military operations, apparently concerned about what they called escalating aggressive tendencies in humanity's approach to the war. Put them through. The holographic display split to include Ambassador Zethkar and General Thak's son, both transmitting from the safety of the council chambers several hundred light-years away. Their expressions carried the mixture of gratitude and terror that had become common among alien species when dealing with human military operations. Honored human commanders, Zethkar began carefully, the Council wishes to express its appreciation for your success in halting the swarm's advance. However, we must address concerns about your proposed assault on their command facility. What concerns? Admiral Chun asked with dangerous politeness. General Thak's son activated a data display showing casualty projections that made even the human officers wince. Our military analysts project that any direct assault on the swarm stronghold would result in the complete destruction of the attacking force. The strategic value of such an operation cannot justify the certain loss of your remaining fleet. Kane exchanged glances with his fellow commanders. The alien general's concerns were entirely reasonable from a conventional military perspective. The proposed assault was essentially a suicide mission with no guarantee of success, which, from a human perspective, made it absolutely irresistible. General Thak's son, Kane replied calmly, your projections assume that we intend to fight this battle using conventional tactics. Are you not? The alien officer asked with obvious confusion. Admiral Chen smiled with the expression that had become famous throughout human space as the Chun grin, a look that suggested someone was about to discover exciting new definitions of the word violence. Gentlemen, we've been fighting the swarm for 3 weeks using conventional human tactics. The results have been encouraging, but not decisive. It's time to escalate to unconventional human tactics. What? Zethkar asked with growing alarm. Do you consider unconventional? The answer came from Colonel Martinez, who had been quietly coordinating with human research teams throughout the galaxy. We're going to detonate a star. The silence that followed was so profound that Kane could hear the subtle humming of the command center's environmental systems. On the split screen, both alien representatives sat frozen with expressions of absolute horror. You cannot be serious, General Thak's son finally managed. Completely serious, Admiral Chen confirmed. Human astrophysicists have developed a method for triggering controlled stellar collapse using modified antimatter charges deployed in precise sequence around a star's core. The resulting supernova will sterilize everything within a 50 light-year radius, including your own forces. Zethkar protested. Only if we're not fast enough, Kane pointed out reasonably. The plan calls for simultaneous assault on the swarm installation while the stellar charges are being positioned. We extract what we can from the facility, then withdraw before the star goes critical. Ambassador Zethkar's 4 eyes were blinking in rapid sequence, a sign of extreme stress among his species. This is madness. You're proposing to destroy an entire star system to eliminate a single enemy installation. It's not just any installation, Admiral Chen corrected. It's their primary command center and manufacturing facility. Eliminating it will cripple their ability to coordinate operations and replace their losses. But the cost, General Thaxon objected. The resources required for such an operation could fund conventional military campaigns for decades. Kane looked at the alien general with the patient expression of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. General, you're thinking like a civilized being. You're weighing costs against benefits and calculating optimal resource allocation. He gestured toward the images of the swarm installation, where the processed remains of entire civilizations were being converted into instruments of further destruction. We're not trying to win a cost-effective military campaign. We're trying to send a message that will echo through the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. The message, Kane reflected, would be characteristically human in its simplicity. This is what happens when you threaten our neighborhood. The Galactic Council cannot authorize such an operation, Zethkar declared firmly. The precedent alone would be catastrophic. If species begin using stellar engineering as a military weapon, the consequences for galactic stability would be unthinkable. Admiral Chen's expression didn't change, but her voice carried an edge that made even the human officers pay attention. Ambassador, with all due respect, we weren't asking for authorization. The implications of that statement settled over the communication channel like a cold wind. The alien representatives suddenly realized that they weren't participating in a planning session. They were being informed of decisions that had already been made. Sir, interrupted Lieutenant Torres, we're receiving confirmation from the engineering teams. Operation Sunburst is ready for implementation. Kane nodded to Admiral Chun, who began transmitting deployment orders to the human fleet. Throughout human space, ships began moving into position for an operation that would either end the war or establish humanity as the galaxy's most dangerous species. Possibly both. Generals, Chen announced to her fellow human commanders, we launch in 6 hours. Remember, we're not just fighting for victory. We're fighting to make sure that no future enemy ever makes the mistake of threatening human space. As the communication ended and the command staff began their final preparations, Kane stood quietly looking at the tactical displays. In 6 hours, humanity would either achieve the greatest military victory in galactic history, or demonstrate that their species' capacity for magnificent destruction was exceeded only by their complete inability to recognize impossible odds. He suspected that either outcome would be entirely acceptable to the human crews who were even now preparing to fly into a battle that would be remembered until the stars burned out. After all, as every human soldier knew, there was no such thing as impossible odds. There were only insufficient applications of high explosives. The star was dying beautifully. Commander Lisa Park watched from the bridge of the UES Prometheus as the massive stellar body began its artificial collapse, nuclear fusion stuttering under the influence of precisely placed antimatter charges that human engineers had spent 3 weeks positioning around its core. In approximately 47 minutes, the star would achieve critical mass and explode with enough force to sterilize every biological organism within 50 light years, including, if they weren't very fast and very lucky, the human fleet that had triggered this cosmic catastrophe. Status report. Park called out, her voice calm despite the fact that she was currently overseeing what was arguably the most dangerous military operation in galactic history. Antimatter charges are achieving optimal cascade resonance, reported Lieutenant Commander Singh from the engineering station. Stellar collapse will reach critical threshold in 46 minutes, 37 seconds. Assault teams. Admiral Chen's forces have successfully breached the swarm installation's outer defenses, called out Major Rodriguez from Tactical. They're reporting heavy resistance, but steady progress toward the primary objectives. Park nodded, watching the tactical display that showed hundreds of human ships engaged in brutal close combat with swarm defenders around the biomechanical facility that had processed the remains of entire civilizations. The battle was going exactly as planned, which meant it was controlled chaos conducted by professionals who specialized in turning impossible situations into merely improbable ones. The real question was whether they could extract their forces before the star exploded. Aboard the UES Indomitable, Admiral Chen was discovering that fighting inside a swarm installation was like conducting military operations inside a living nightmare designed by someone who had never heard of architectural safety codes. The corridors pulsed with organic energy, the walls occasionally tried to digest anything that touched them, and the defensive systems appeared to have been designed by a committee of homicidal biologists. Deck 7 secured, reported Captain Santos over the comm system. We've located what appears to be their primary data core. It's disturbing. Chen could imagine. Human intelligence had theorized that the swarm maintained detailed records of the civilizations they consumed, probably for the purpose of improving their digestion techniques. The prospect of accessing those records was both strategically valuable and psychologically horrifying. Extract everything you can, she ordered. We've got 43 minutes before this place becomes the center of a very large fireball. Ma'am, interrupted Sergeant Vasquez from her position near the installation's central hub. You need to see this. Chun followed the Marine through corridors that seemed designed to induce claustrophobia and madness in equal measure. The walls were covered with organic circuits that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, and the air smelled of something between ozone and decomposition. They emerged into a vast chamber that defied every principle of rational construction. The space was spherical, with no clear indication of up or down, and filled with floating biomechanical structures that served purposes Chun couldn't begin to guess. At the center of the chamber, suspended in what appeared to be a gravity field, was something that made even battle-hardened human Marines pause in stunned silence. It was a swarm creature, but unlike any they had encountered before. This one was massive, easily the size of a small building, and its biomechanical form was far more complex than the warrior variants they had been fighting. Multiple layers of organic armor covered a body that seemed to incorporate technology from dozens of different species. Most unsettling of all, it was clearly alive and aware, watching them with dozens of eyes that reflected an intelligence that was both alien and unmistakably hostile. Is that what I think it is? Vasquez asked quietly. Chun studied the creature with professional interest, noting the way its form incorporated design elements from ships they had seen in the Galactic Council archives. Kepler energy matrices, hegemony biocircuits, Trade Federation computational nodes, all integrated into a single organism that represented the collective knowledge of every civilization the swarm had consumed. It's their central intelligence, she realized, not just a command unit. It's the sum total of every species they've ever encountered. The creature shifted in its containment field, and Chun heard something that chilled her to the bone, the sound of voices. Dozens of them, speaking in languages from across the galaxy, all emanating from the same source. It wasn't just their commander. It was their collective memory of everyone they had ever killed. Admiral, came Lieutenant Kim's voice over the comm, tight with urgency. Stellar collapse is accelerating ahead of projections. We have 38 minutes to extraction. Chen looked at the massive creature one more time, weighing tactical value against time constraints. The intelligence data contained within that organism could provide insights into swarm technology and strategy that would take decades to acquire through conventional means. On the other hand, they were standing next to a star that was about to explode with the force of a cosmic temper tantrum. Set charges around the containment field, she ordered. We can't extract it, but we can make sure it doesn't survive the stellar collapse. Ma'am, Vasquez pointed out, The star explosion will destroy everything anyway. Maybe, Chen replied grimly. But I've seen too much in this war to trust that something this abominable won't find a way to survive. We make sure. 20 minutes later, the human assault teams began their fighting withdrawal from the swarm installation. It was a process that involved setting explosive charges on every critical system they could identify, while simultaneously engaging swarm defenders who were becoming increasingly desperate as they realized their central command was under threat. The biomechanical corridors became battlegrounds where human marines fought creatures that represented the collective military knowledge of 17 conquered civilizations. Energy weapons designed by species that had mastered physics millions of years before humanity left Earth were turned against soldiers who responded with chemical explosives and kinetic projectiles that predated interstellar civilization by millennia. It should have been a hopeless mismatch. Instead, it was exactly the kind of fight that humanity had been optimized for through millions of years of evolutionary pressure and 3 centuries of professional military development. Extraction Team Alpha, report. Admiral Chen called in her comm as she led her own group toward the installation's docking base. We're out, and clear, came Captain Morrison's voice. Installation charges will detonate in 18 minutes. Extraction Team Beta? Still fighting our way to the shuttles, reported Major Santos. These things really don't want us to leave. Chen wasn't surprised. The swarm had invested enormous resources in this installation, and they were defending it with everything they had. The problem was that everything they had was being deployed against an enemy that had turned tactical improvisation into a form of performance art. Admiral, came Commander Park's voice from the Prometheus. Stellar collapse is reaching critical phase. You have 16 minutes to clear the blast radius. 16 minutes to travel 50 light years. Chun did the mathematics in her head and reached a conclusion that was both satisfying and terrifying. They're going to make it, but only if everything went perfectly. In Chen's experience, nothing ever went perfectly. All teams, emergency extraction protocol, she announced. Leave everything that isn't nailed down, and if it is nailed down, blow it up and leave anyway. The human withdrawal from the swarm installation became a textbook example of controlled demolition under combat conditions. As the assault teams fought their way to the extraction points, they left behind a trail of explosive charges, booby traps, and improvised incendiary devices that turned the facility into a maze of delayed destruction. When the last human shuttle cleared the installation's defensive perimeter, the biomechanical structure was already beginning to tear itself apart from internal explosions. Energy conduits overloaded, organic walls caught fire, and structural supports failed in cascading waves of destruction. But the real fireworks were yet to come. All ships, jump to hyperspace on my mark, Admiral Chun transmitted to the human fleet. Around her, hundreds of vessels that had survived the most brutal military operation in human history prepared for the desperate flight that would carry them away from a stellar explosion that would be visible from neighboring galaxies. Mark, she called, and the human fleet vanished into the safety of faster-than-light travel just as the star reached critical mass. The explosion that followed redefined several galactic records for destruction caused by military operations. The star collapsed and rebounded in a matter of seconds, releasing more energy than most civilizations used in their entire existence. The swarm installation, along with everything else within 50 light years, was reduced to constituent atoms in a flash of cosmic fire that would be studied by astrophysicists for generations. More importantly, from humanity's perspective, the explosion sent a very clear message throughout the galaxy. When the light of the artificial supernova finally reached the Galactic Council chambers 3 days later, Ambassador Zethkar stood before the assembled representatives and delivered the news that would reshape galactic politics for centuries to come. The Swarm Command installation has been completely destroyed, he announced. Human forces achieved total tactical success with minimal losses. The chamber erupted in sounds that each species used to express stunned disbelief. For the first time in the war, they had achieved a decisive victory against the Void Swarm. What are the strategic implications? asked Chancellor Mordaunt. General Thak's son activated a holographic display showing swarm movements throughout the galaxy. The enemy fleet elements are retreating toward the galactic rim. Without their central command, they appear to be reverting to basic survival behaviors. They're running away, Zethkar translated. More than that, added Dr. Yilnara, reviewing the psychological data. They're exhibiting clear signs of trauma response. The destruction of their command center appears to have convinced them that humanity represents an existential threat to their species. The irony was not lost on any of the council members. The Void Swarm, which had terrorized the galaxy as an unstoppable force of consumption and destruction, was now fleeing in fear from a species that represented less than 1% of the galaxy's total population. What do the humans want in exchange for their military assistance? Chancellor Mordaunt asked the question that everyone had been dreading. Zethkar consulted his communications from Admiral Chun. The message was characteristically brief and direct. We want to be left alone to pursue our own interests without interference from galactic authorities. In other words, humanity wanted exactly what they had always wanted: the freedom to be themselves without having to explain their choices to anyone else. The Council voted unanimously to grant that request. 6 months later, the war was officially declared over. The Void Swarm had retreated beyond the galactic rim and showed no signs of returning. Humanity had saved galactic civilization and established themselves as the species you definitely didn't want to anger. Admiral Chun stood on the observation deck of the UES Indomitable, now serving as flagship of the Human Defense Forces, watching the peaceful stars of the Centauri sector. The war was over, the galaxy was safe, and humanity had earned the respect of every species that valued continued existence. "Sir," reported Captain Rodriguez, "we're receiving a transmission from Earth. High Command is asking if we want to return home for the victory celebration." Chun considered the question while watching a nearby star system, where human colonists were already beginning the process of turning 3 dead worlds into thriving agricultural colonies using techniques that would have been considered impossible by more civilized species. "Tell them we'll pass," she replied. "We've got a galaxy to explore, and I understand there are some interesting rumors about hostile alien activity in the Andromeda Galaxy." Rodriguez grinned. "Should I tell them we're volunteering for the next impossible mission?" "Tell them," Chun said with the expression that had become known throughout human space as the smile that launched 1,000 battles, "that we're looking forward to meeting new friends." The galaxy was finally at peace. For now. But somewhere in the darkness between stars, humanity was already making plans for the next time someone needed to be reminded that this was their neighborhood, and they didn't appreciate uninvited guests. After all, as every human knew, peace was just war waiting for the right moment to get interesting again. And humans were very good at making things interesting.